Hello chat, and welcome to the first of a series of devlogs that I'm making to showcase a game that I'm making, called Tsujigiri. So in this video, we're going to cover how to get started making a Unity 2D game. And this seems like a daunting task, so here's a bit of foundation that we'll provide to get you started that may help you. For me personally, I am making a pixel art platformer, and this can be different for you whether you want to make your art style not in pixel art, or you're making a top-down, some sort RPG. These tips may or may not apply to you. For my game, I have a roadmap of the things I want to create over time. First being the player, then I'm going to create the platforming, then some blocks, the attacks of the player, and then I start with enemies, backgrounds, and then make the generation for the levels because I'm making a roguelike, which means the levels are going to be randomly generated. Then I need to make some particles. I'm going to make the UI, then add some items, and then maybe add some NPCs, bosses, and for those things, I'm going to repeat for each world that I'm going to create. Finally, I'll add up some audio, and then the transition menus that would take you between different levels. Now, this doesn't have to be the roadmap you have to follow. Now, I'm going to go through a few steps that you should do before starting your game. However, you don't have to do it if you don't want to. They're just recommendations. And you also don't have to do it immediately. You should probably do it after you make your first player so that you can test those changes and tweak with them and see which ones you actually want to implement and not. So the first thing is you want to set up the resolution of your camera. You want to basically decide how big your game is going to show up. And for most computers, will be in the aspect of a 16:9 ratio. And personally, I use 1920 times 1080. And for Unity specifically, you can change this by going into the game tab and then just changing your camera size to be that. The next thing you want to do is to set up your controls. The way you do this is to go to Project Settings and then Input Manager. And in Input Manager, you can change the different controls and keybinds that you want the player to have. And once you do this, it will be much easier for you to implement into your game. So you probably want to set that up as early as possible. Now, you might not be doing a pixel art game, but if you are, I recommend adding the pixel perfect camera to your camera game object. What the pixel perfect camera basically does is when you play the game, it maps all of your sprite pixels to a perfect place in the grid so that you don't have pixels that are in between other pixels, so you maybe get blurred or stretched pixels in your game. And it just overall makes pixel art look much better. Now, if you're not doing pixel art, this may not be necessary. Speaking of art, you also want to set up the sprite settings that you want to use for your game. Unity has a lot of settings for textures and sprites, and the way you can change these is first just take any picture and drag it into Unity, and once you click on the texture that it makes, you will be able to see all these settings on the right in the inspector. And the specific things that you should change is the pixels per unit is important because that determines how big your sprites are generally going to be in your camera. You also want to change the filter mode, format, and compression to whatever you like best for your game. I personally like 0 compression, the format will be automatic, and the filter mode is point no filter. I like these for my sprites, but again, you can change them depending on what feel you like for your game. Now, the next thing you probably want to do is to set up the collision layer matrix. For any game that requires physics or any sort of collision, which most likely you will have, you will need to set up a thing in the project settings that basically determines which layers interact with which other layers. This is a good thing to set up early because as you're making more and more things, more and more entities and objects, you don't want them all to be colliding with each other, and you want to save some processing power so they don't check every other layer during calculations. Now, the way you do this is you go into Project Settings, Physics 2D, and the Layer Collision Matrix. If you don't have many layers here, just go and create some layers. For example, I have the layers of player, the entities, which I can also elaborate on later. The next thing you might want to do is create parent classes for entities that you want to share behavior with. For example, I have a parent class called Entity2D that every one of my entities extends. Every time I want a property that every entity should have, maybe that be a reference, or maybe that be some sort of physics, I want maybe all entities to have ground detection. I will put that into my entities 2D and all my entities will extend that. So I have one for entity 2D and I also have one for a damageable class, which means anything that can take damage will have the damageable class. And every other enemy that I make or player, I'm going to extend those classes so everything is consistent. You might also want to consider adding a block class for all of the colliders that you want to be considered as objects or blocks. This might be good for ground detection. Maybe you have a bunch of other things in the block layer, but you only want to filter for specific ones that have the block class. I also use a global object that has a game manager and a library class that everything that will be in the scene should reference. The game manager handles all of the global game events, and the library stores assets like particles and static functions, and maybe some sounds that I want everything to share. When I want to run something, I want to create something from another script that is a global shared asset, I would reference the game manager and library classes for that. The next thing you want to do, this is not really a change, but you should take note of the script execution order that is in your project settings. And this basically determines which orders some scripts run, and some may take priority over others. One of the reasons you want to take note of this is because later when you add inputs and scripts that work with each other, you want to make sure that the right script runs first. So it's good to take a look at that and just take a note of which scripts run first so it helps when you make your code later. And one note when designing games in general, it's a good idea to try to make all of your code and assets modular. What this means is that, let's say you have a behavior for something to move in a direction, or you have a behavior for a hitbox that will hurt other things. It's a good idea to make that a separate class that you can attach onto different items. Now, Unity has great support for this because Unity lets you attach as many components as you want to a game object, which means that if you want a certain behavior, just make a class for that behavior and attach it onto every entity that you want them to have. It's good for keeping things consistent, and it also is good for not having the same code copy and pasted across each enemy or each object that shares similar behavior. Well, congratulations. You've now started making your game. Once you have all these fundamentals, it's now time to start creating the actual meat of your game, which I will cover in a series of other videos that follow this one. And if you'd like to support what I do, please go wishlist Tsujigiri on Steam. It's an indie game that I'm making myself, and I hope to get it released in the next few years. And I would appreciate it if you could check it out. All right, goodbye, everyone.